Hi friends, my name is Gil Student, and I'd like to try something different here that I've never done before, and that's speak out an idea on video, sort of a bit of a book review, but also discuss an idea over a long span of time. And the book I'm thinking about is Ani Maamin by Professor Joshua Berman, Rabbi Josh Berman, who's a Ben Torah, a scholar, a friend. I disagree with a lot that's in this book. But it's a very interesting book for multiple reasons. It's really two books in one. The first half of the book is discussing the truth of the Bible, in particular the Chumash, from the perspective of biblical scholarship. Professor Berman is professor of Bible at Bar Ilan, and in that first half, he says some things that I don't feel comfortable with. But he does it from a place of Yiras Shamayim, of tremendous passion and religiosity and faith. And he offers tools for people who are struggling with the idea of the truth of the Bible, the truth of the Torah. And he struggles with it as well with the reader, and offers quite a number of tools that are very powerful for someone struggling with that idea. Again, I won't sign my name to it, but it's useful for the right person. The second half, he traces the idea of the 13 principles of faith throughout Jewish intellectual history, and that's what I'd like to focus on, because he raises a lot of good questions, makes a lot of good points. I think he's totally wrong, and I'd like to discuss that with you a little bit, why I think that way. So just some brief background. Jewish the principles of faith, the Ikkarei Emunah, are discussed in the Mishnah. So it's one of our earliest Jewish sources. It's the Mishnah and Sanhedrin. So we could debate whether that really refers to the Ikkarei Emunah, the dogma, the Jewish dogma, or not. That has been done by historians. I direct people to Lawrence Schiffman's discussion in his book Who Was a Jew for a presentation that I think has a lot of merit and is more traditional in his perspective. But be that as it may, so throughout time we see, let's say, Reb Sadia Gaon, and then the Rambam really formalized it, codified it in his 13 principles of faith. And that is a sticking point. It is, right now, many people consider the Rambam's 13 principles of faith, the Ikkarei Emunah, to be the binding dogma of Judaism. And that's something that many people struggle with. And Professor Berman discusses that at length. And part of his point is that we lose track of these principles of faith for a few hundred years in Jewish history. So the Rambam, he discusses it. He passed away at the early, I think it's 1204, something like that. It's continued to be debated in the medieval times. Were there really 13 principles, or are there only 3 principles that could be divided down into 13 or more? Or many different, they go back and forth. Why is this principle here? Why should it be there? Should it not be there? I once saw in an email list that Rabbi Shalom Karmi, the great Rabbi Shalom Karmi, and I don't think he should be held to this. An email he sent to an email list is not necessarily something that he wants published. I'm only mentioning it because I'm going to disagree with him and then show that he's really right. So in this email, someone had asked, when did the whole discussion of the Rambam's 13 Ikkarim, Ikkarei Emunah, really fall out of practice? You don't see it discussed anymore. So when did it stop being discussed? And he suggested it was with the publication of Abarbanel's Rosh Hashanah. Abarbanel, who passed away the early 16th century, the first decade of the 1500s, and I mention that because it's going to be important. So the Abarbanel is Rosh Hashanah. He has a small book, but a very big book, in which he defends the Rambam's 13 Ikkarei Emunah from criticism in a very characteristically methodical way. He lists a whole bunch of questions, and then he, boom, 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 chapter after chapter, he answers all the questions and resolves all to his satisfaction, and really to my satisfaction to a large degree as well, all the questions revolving around the Rambam's 13 principles. So I don't know exactly, I didn't check it up. It's probably the late 1400s when that was published, and that was, Rabbi Karmi suggested, that was the end of the polemic around the Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikkarei Emunah, and I mention that because actually a few decades later in 1576, I mentioned that because that's an important year as well. In 1576, the Mabit, Rav Moshe de Trani, he published his Beis Elokim, and the bulk of Beis Elokim is the third section, Shar HaYesodos, which is based on the Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikkarei, and which the Mabit accepts them as binding, defends them to a large degree, shows the sources, and explains what they mean. It's a beautiful sefer. And the Mabit was one of the two main rabbis in Tzfas at that time. The other one was the Beis Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo, author of the Shulchan Aruch. And the two of them, they were both students, faithful students of the Mahari Beirav, but they were very, very different people, different personalities. And of course, the Arizal had been there at some point and started Kabbalah, his school of Kabbalah around there. And the Mabit and the Beis Yosef were both pretty much excluded from that, but they were Kabbalists in their own right. Beis Elokim, I don't see any Kabbalah in there. I'm sure it's hidden within his conversations, in his behind the scenes, but in front of the scenes, there's no Kabbalah there. Just like, by the way, a lot of the Beis Yosef's writing, let's say his stuff ala Torah and the Drusha's Beis Yosef, I didn't see any Kabbalah there. Maybe there is, but it wasn't evident to me. Anyway, so I would say the Beis Elokim in 1576 is really the end of the grand discussion of the Yud Gimel Ikkarei Emunah. And then after that, and I'll come back to why Rabbi Carmi is really right, but after that, you don't really see much discussion of that. And that's something that Professor Berman picks up in his book. Why? What happened? So he wants to say, largely, that we don't follow the Rambam. We don't paskin like the Rambam. And it only became more popular to paskin like the Rambam, to follow that view of that set of dogma. Of course, there are beliefs inherent to Judaism, otherwise it wouldn't be a religion, wouldn't be a faith. But the Rambam's codification, the harsh codification, you don't really see that discussed anymore until the fight against reform in the 1800s. In the 19th century and the 20th centuries, when the Ikkarei Emunah were raised up in order to define Judaism and to attack reform and other deviationists, other progressives and non-traditionalists who deviated from that traditional Judaism. And as such, I don't believe Professor Berman is saying we should just throw out the Yud Gimel Ikkarei Emunah, but we should look at it, we should see it as it is, which is a boundary marker to exclude those who would destroy the faith from the perspective of traditional Judaism. So, for example, the Reform, who don't believe that the commandments are binding, or necessarily that the Torah was given by God, so that's destructive to traditional faith, and therefore the boundary, the Yud Gimel Ikkarei, the Rambam was basically used as a shield or as a fence to exclude those who would defeat the faith or undermine the faith. And that's where I'd like to completely look at it completely differently. So let's go back to Abarbanel. Abarbanel, I said, so I think everything happens that we need to talk about really in the 16th century, in the 1500s. That is the key, in particular, the decade of the 1570s. But before then, so the Abarbanel lived before then. As I said, he passed away much earlier than that. In his Rosh Hashanah, so his conclusion, while most of the bulk of the book is defending the Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikkarei Emunah, in the end, he says, but you know what, I don't accept it. I don't think he's right. The Abarbanel says, everything is an Ikkarei Emunah. Every commandment in the Torah is a principle of faith. If you reject one mitzvah, you reject the Torah, and that is a more encompassing, a stricter, if you will, version of dogma. To the Rambam, if you rejected the 13 Ikkarei Emunah, you were out. You rejected Jewish dogma. Anything else, you were wrong. You were wrong. You're committing a sin, maybe. But you didn't breach the dogma of the faith of Judaism. Abarbanel says everything's a dogma. It's a much stricter view. Because if you reject anything, any mitzvah, any idea, you're no longer within the fold. You're outside the fold. That's a big deal. Similarly, the Radbaz who passed away in the 1570s, he lived almost 100 years, which was pretty unheard of. He was exiled from Spain in the 1490s when he was already, I think, around 20 years old. not older, had a long life, ended up in Sfas with the Mabit and the Beis Yosef, and the Radbaz has a tshuva. Someone asked him about the Ikkarei Emunah, and he said, the whole Torah is in Ikkarei Emunah. Everything is in Ikkar. So like a Barbanel, it's not that they rejected the Rambam and therefore they were more open. They rejected the Rambam and therefore they were more closed. They had a much bigger fence. The Rambam had 13 Ikkarim as a fence. Barbanel and Radbaz had much more. And we see that later in history. So, for example, the Bach lived in the 1600s. So he has, in his Chuvas, Siman Hay, he was asked about someone in Amsterdam who rejected Kabbalah. And the Bach says he rejects Kabbalah, he rejects Judaism. He says, HaKabbalah shu mekor HaTorah ve'ikara ve'kula yira shamayim. You reject Kabbalah, you reject the Torah. Therefore, you're out. You're gone. Should be in Cherem. That's what he says. He says should be in Cherem. He mentions in there, not only that, he accepts philosophy. Philosophy is minus, meaning heresy, and therefore he should be excluded. But to the Bach, just rejecting Kabbalah, or rejecting the Torah, without even going in, he doesn't mention Yud Gimel Ikarim. He doesn't need to, because he has a bigger fence than the Rambam does. Later, in the 1700s, just giving a few examples. Professor Berman brings plenty of examples as well. I'm just bringing some examples he did not bring. So the Chacham Tzvi in Siman Yud Ches, the Bach was in Yeshanos Siman Hay. Chacham Tzvi in Siman Yud Ches was asked about a rabbi in London, a Sephardic rabbi in London, Rabbi David Nieto, known for publishing the Kuzari Sheni, some other writings. So he gave a sermon, and he was accused by some of his congregants of being a pantheist like Spinoza. And the Chacham Tzvi says, yeah, pantheism is a problem, but what he believes is panentheism, which is not. That's perfectly okay. Nowhere in here is there any talk of Yud Gimel Ikarim. Doesn't mention it. Doesn't mention it. The Yud Gimel Ikarim were not an issue, because they were much more closed than the Rambam. And we see this even in the 1570s. We see this very clear. The 1570s, by Azariah Derasi, Azariah Min Hadumim, published a book. He's in Italy. He knew the Beis Yosef personally. He helped the Beis Yosef publish the Kesef Mishnah, the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Kara's commentary on the Mishnah Torah. So the Rabbi Azariah Derasi published his book, Me'orei Naim, in which he compared Talmudic history, the history of the world and of Judaism as it emerges from the Talmud and Midrash. He compared that with ancient historical sources, particularly Roman sources. He had a tremendous knowledge of ancient languages, and he compared them all in his unique style, and he outraged the rabbinic world. Part of it was he published it without any haskamas, without any rabbinic approbations, which was not allowed at that point. And there was an outrage. There was a whole force against him. There's an interesting biography of the Beis Yosef by Rabbi Yekusiel Greenwald of Columbus, Ohio, in which he claims, I think wrong, he's a very optimistic kind of person, likes to see unity in the Jewish world, perhaps a little over-optimistic and sees things a little too glossy, too rose-colored glasses. So he suggests that when Rabbi Azariah Derasi published his Matzreif LaKesef, in which he explained and defended his Me'orei Naim, that satisfied the rabbis, and there was Shalom al Yisrael. Everybody, I don't think that's correct. So there are many. Professor Reuven Bonfil, in his edition of the Kisvei Azariah Min Hadomim, so he has a very long introduction. And he discusses the rabbinic opposition to it, and he points out a lot of the rabbinic opposition to it was that the Me'orei Naim could lead to heresy, meaning it didn't show the proper deference to the Talmudic sages, which could lead people to reject other things. So it's ambiguous language. But some people didn't have ambiguous language. Their language was clear as water. So, for example, the Maharal, Rabbi Yehuda Leib from Prague, in his Be'er Hagola, his Be'er Shishi, so the second half of his sixth section of Be'er Hagola is devoted to refuting many of the claims, or arguing with many of the claims of Rabbi Zaya Derasi. He also says how bad theologically the book is. At no point does he say that it violates the Rambam's 13 Ikkarei Emunah. He doesn't say that. He could have said that. He could have tried to make that argument. He does not say that. Yet he still says this book is completely off the charts, outside the fold. Why? So what's he saying? Why doesn't he use the Yud Gimel Ikkarei Emunah? Because to Maharal, if you disagree with anything in the Talmud, that alone puts you outside of the fold. That's what he's saying, I believe. I believe that's what he's saying. And we can see that somewhere else in his Nesivas Olam, the Maharal. Maharal talks about Nesivas Olam. In his Nesivas Olam is Nesiv HaVoda, Perek Yud Beis. So that's where he talks about Machnise Rachamim. Machnise Rachamim is a piyut, it's a liturgical poem in the Slichos that we say as we approach Rosh Hashanah and on Rosh Hashanah. So at one point in the Slichos, we say Machnise Rachamim. We ask the angels to bring our prayers to God. And that is, you could make the argument, and not you couldn't, it's very clearly against one of the Rambam's fundamental principles. Maharal doesn't say that. He says it's against the Talmud, it's asur, outside the fold. Instead, he makes a slight grammatical change. Instead of Machnise Rachamim, Hachnisu Rachamenu, that they should bring in, we asked the angels to bring our prayers to God. He said we should change it to Yachnisu Rachamenu, saying that they will. That's their job. They are God's, they don't have any choice in that. We're really praying to God. They're just the mechanism that brings it there. According to Maharal, that solves the problem. But what's interesting, and what I'm trying to emphasize, is that the Maharal himself doesn't invoke the Yud Gimel Ikkarei Emunah, but still has the concept of heresy. And to the Maharal, like the Abarbanel, like the Radbaz, if you're outside, if you reject anything in the Torah, anything, that itself is heresy. That's outside the bounds. It's a much larger, higher fence than the Rambam had. And going back to Me'or Einayim, so the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, so he passed away in the 1570s. He passed away just a few years after Me'or Einayim was published, as did Rabbi Zaya Derasi. He also passed away, and the Radbaz passed away in that decade as well. So the Beis Yosef, when he learned about the Me'or Einayim, we know exactly what happened. The Chida, Reb Chaim Yosef David Azulai, at the end of the 1700s, publishes Machzik Bracha, and in his Kuntras Achront Orach Chaim, Simin Shin Zayin, that's where the Beis Yosef, where the Shulchan Aruch talks about the books you're not allowed to learn on Shabbos, including that he includes some history books and some romance novels, not for today's discussion. In the Machzik Bracha, Kuntras Achront, that Simin Shin Zayin, Sif Hey, so he quotes something that he found in manuscript from Rabbi Elisha Galikin, who was a student of Rabbi Yosef Karo, and this Rabbi Elisha, he got the Me'or Einayim, was so offended by it, he brought it to Rabbi Yosef Karo. He writes this in manuscript, and Professor Bonfil says, I think they've since found actual manuscripts that confirm the exact language that the Chida has here. He brought it to the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef took it, Rabbi Yosef Karo took it for a few days. Afterwards, he told this Rabbi Elisha, write down this cherem that I want to issue on Me'or Einayim. But then Rabbi Yosef Karo, before that could happen, he fell sick to his final illness and was never able to issue that cherem. The language that he uses, though, is that he says this book is offensive to the Torah and the Ikkarim, the fundamentals of the Torah. It doesn't say Yud Gimel Ikkarim, but what he is saying, though, is that this Me'or Einayim is contrary to contrary to the fundamentals of Judaism as he understood it. Which means, I think, the Beis Yosef, just like the Maharal, just like the Barbanel and Radbaz, have a much higher barrier. And I should say that the Morainaim has been accepted by a significant segment of Gedolim throughout the years. When I first came across Amaretz Chayes's Torah's Nevim, never forget it. I came early to Yerodea Shir in the house of, I was attending Yerodea Shir in the house of Mordechai Marcus. He was the Rav of the Lakewood Minyan in Flatbush. Huge genius. And he gave a Yerodea Shir on Sunday in his house. One day I got there a little early. The door was open to his house. I came and sat down in the living room. And, I was waiting for everybody else. And I looking around. The living room had Sfarim all over the place. And I saw a 2-volume Kol Sifrei Maharatz Chayes. People are familiar with that edition. Took it off the shelf, was flipping through it, was very interested. And then Rabbi Marcus came in. And I was the only one there. And nobody else had come yet. So I said, this is very interesting. Nothing I've ever seen before. And he said, I remember this, he said, all said and done, the Maharatz Chayes wore a kapata and the shtreimel like everybody else. And I took that to mean that, okay, he's strange, he's different. The Maharatz Chayes is unusual, but he's still within our canon. He was still a frumma yid, and you're allowed to be different. You're allowed to have your own thing. So the Maharatz Chayes is a very unique style. And for years, it's difficult for many people. For other people, I love that style. When I finally got my hands on the Morainaim, I recognized immediately that's where the Maharatz Chayes got his style from. Not only does he quote the Morainaim like he was one of the Gedolim, which he does, the Maharatz Chayes does, he took his entire approach, his style of writing from the Morainaim. It's clear as day for anyone who's familiar with both writings. And Ramatis Yehush Strashun, the son of the Rashash, once wrote an article for a journal where he lists every place he's ever seen anyone at Tosfos Yontif. Tosfos Yontif was a Talmud of the Maharal, and he was quoting Morainaim. The Tzemach David, who was also a Talmud of the Maharal, is quoting Morainaim. It was very, very much accepted in certain circles. Other circles, not so much. Maharatz Chayes isn't either. Look, the Minchas Al-Lazar screams and shouts about the Maharatz Chayes and Apigaras, and says, okay, no. People are a little more open-minded, different types. People more open-minded are okay with the Maharatz Chayes and are okay with the Rebbe Zariah Min Adumim. I, the Beis Yosef, was not. I, the Maharal, was not. Different strokes for different folks. You have to say. But what my point, though, got off track. My point, though, is that they were more machmir than the Rambam. Why don't they mention Ikkarei Emunah? Because the Rambam was too makel for them. He was too lenient. He was too open-minded. They were much stricter, much more closed. They had a higher barrier of entry of what's acceptable in Judaism than the Rambam, and that continued for generations. So what's the point? What's the big deal? That when you get to the 1800s, and they're faced with the challenge of reform, and the Rabbanim have to crystallize exactly what is in and what is out, and create their fences, and create their boundary markers of what is Orthodox Judaism and what is outside the bounds of traditional Judaism. They had this challenge. If they're too strict, they will write out too many people. If they're too lenient, they will allow heresy to foment within the community. And they wanted to be honest. And the selection, the use of the Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikkarei Emunah in the 1800s, in the 19th and 20th centuries, I'm arguing, is a big kula, it's a big leniency. It's not that they wanted to push people out, so they took this Yud Gimel Ikkarei Emunah and created some big chumras and big strictures and built this big walls. No, they didn't build the big walls. The walls were pretty big. They reached back to the Rambam and they lowered it. It was a big kula, a big leniency to follow the Yud Gimel Ikkarei Emunah. And you can argue we don't follow exactly. And I think that's true. Some people do say Machnisei Rachamim with the original text, not the way the Maharal changes it. They say Machnisei Rachamim Hachnisu Rachamenu. Maharal says you have to say Yachnisu, and if you don't, he doesn't say this, but if you don't, it's against one of the Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikkarei Emunah. Some people say hachnisu. We're even more lenient than that. But be that as it may, that's not my point. My point is not to argue exactly how we paskin nowadays on Ikkarei Emunah. It's really to argue about the intellectual history that really Rabbi Karmi was right. That when the Abarbanel published his Rosh Hashanah, and he said, he defended the Rambam's Ikkarei Emunah, but he said, really, I believe everything's an Ikar. Everything in the Torah is an Ikkarei Emunah. Everything is a fundamental principle. That was the start. I don't think they took it from the Barbanel necessarily, but that was the start that we know of this broader, stricter definition of anything that anyone who disagrees with anything in the Torah is heretical, is out of bounds. And that the use over the past 250 years or so of the Ikkarei Emunah is actually a great leniency. But the truth is both strains still exist. There still are people who will say Ikkarei Emunah are fine. But I remember one time I was davening in Rav Feivel Cohen's shul. Feivel Cohen, the author of the Badei HaShulchan, the big posek in America, used to be in Flatbush, now he's in Lakewood. When I was in Flatbush, when I was first married, I davened in his shul. Remember one time he came back from an Aguda convention, all upset because the Aguda convention, this was in maybe 1994, 95. Aguda convention, they were talking about the tuition crisis. Even back then, they were talking about the tuition crisis. And he said, I don't understand what this tuition crisis is. The Gemara in Beis says very clear, all of the money that you're going to make during the year is set on Rosh Hashanah, except for the money that you put out for Shabbos and Yom meals and for paying for your children to learn Torah. So what are they talking about tuition? He said it's in the Gemara. And you know what we call someone who disagrees with the Gemara. He was being a little facetious, but I think he meant it literally, and I think many other people would agree with him as well. If you disagree with an open Gemara, that's heresy, that's kfira. So I don't think he was calling anyone at the Aguda convention an apikuros. I don't think that's what he meant. I don't think he was calling anyone who complains about tuition crisis an apikuros. I don't think that's what he meant. But he was making his point that he thinks, according to that Gemara, there is no tuition crisis. You could disagree with that. I have what else to say on that. There's another pshat. I think Rabbi Shmuel Kamenetsky has a different pshat on that Gemara, and he's not the only one. But be that as it may, there's a broader conception of the fundamentals of Judaism and the boundary markers still exists in our community today. And those who go to the Ikkarei Emunah as a boundary marker, I believe they are the lenient ones. They're the Mekilim. And I think history has shown that the Bach about someone who rejects Kabbalah, and other examples as well that Professor Berman quotes as well, they were stricter, and we are now being more lenient. We are now being more lenient, but we point to only the Yigimel Karim. That's I believe leniency. So that's what I want to say. I think Professor Berman offers a lot in his book. There's a lot to discuss, a lot to learn from. He teaches a lot of very interesting things, and I think I'll end with that. I wish him bracha and hatzlacha on this book and all his other activities. Like I said, he's a bentor, he's a friend, and a really lovable person. And Emir Hashem, if this video works out, maybe we'll try doing some other ones as well.